The shop did not start with a headline. It started when Iran was hit by Tomahawk cruise missiles, stealth fighters, and for the first time in combat, low-cost one-way attack drones built around the same cheap, disposable logic. Tehran spent years teaching the region to fear. That same strike package also leaned on anthropic AI tools and the low-cost unmanned combat attack system, Lucas. So before Tehran could even tell itself a clean story about what had happened, it was already dealing with a new American mix of precision, mass, and speed. Then Washington gave away just enough to make the rest worse. The strike package, by its own description, included B-2s, fighters, drones, missiles, and classified effects. That means the attack was built so Iran could see enough to feel damage, but not enough to map every layer of how that damage was delivered. One launch crew can tell you more about this war than 10 podium speeches. You survive the first blast, run back toward the mountain, and find the entrance choked, the radios dirty, the timing broken, and the chain of command trying to work out what was real and what was already gone. That is not just a strike. That is shock with a job to do. If you want this war tracked past the slogans, subscribe now and drop your read in the comments. What hit Tehran harder here? The hidden layer, the buried target layer, or the move that came after at sea? Because if you read this wrong, you miss where the real pressure is heading. Once B-2 Spirit bombers were up for Operation Epic Fury, the fiction that this was a symbolic slap vanished. That aircraft goes when distance, hardening, and political sensitivity all matter at once. The message to Tehran was simple and brutal. Depth was no longer protection, and the hidden layer was not empty theater. Coordinated space and cyber operations disrupted communications and sensor networks across the battle space. So while Iran was trying to identify the strike, sort to the noise, and move what still mattered, the attack was already working on its eyesight and nervous system too. The targets tell you what Washington really wanted. B-2 stealth bombers struck hardened ballistic missile facilities overnight. Not soft buildings, not television props, hardened sites. The places built to survive long enough to keep Iran dangerous after the first exchange. Then satellite imagery showed some missile cave entrances collapsed overnight. That single detail is heavier than a dozen dramatic adjectives. A missile still sitting behind a sealed entrance is not usable leverage. It is dead weight until crews can dig, clear, reach it, and bring a broken firing schedule back to life under threat of another hit. Dust, rock, cables, vehicles jammed in the wrong place, somebody shouting for an update nobody can give. That is what classified effects feels like when it reaches the ground. It is not mystical. It is practical. It steals time. And once time goes missing in a missile unit, the rest of the damage compounds fast. That is where Tehran's shock becomes real, not rhetorical. A surviving inventory on paper means very little if access is blocked. Timing is slipping, and every surviving launcher crew knows the next move might arrive before the excavation does. Buried capability can still matter. Buried access kills confidence first. The danger here is not a comic book weapon. The conflict is now a real-world munitions testing ground. Washington does not need one science fiction device to change the balance. It needs a battlefield where stealth, cheap drones, AI-assisted support, buried target strikes, and hidden effects can be fused into one working method. The important part is not novelty by itself. Militaries test things all the time. The dangerous part is when a new combination works under live pressure against a real opponent, on real targets that were built to survive. Once that happens, the experiment stops being a demo. It becomes doctrine. The cheap mass piece is not a side note. The Army bought 13,000 interceptor drones for its MEROP system in roughly 8 days. That tells you Washington learned the ugliest lesson in this war, very fast. Exquisite force is not enough by itself. You need numbers, you need replaceability, and you need a way to keep pressure high without paying luxury prices for every minute of the fight. There is a mean little irony sitting inside that. Iran spent years showing the region how much trouble a cheap, throwaway, flying threat could cause. Now that same logic is being absorbed, scaled, and pushed back at industrial volume by a richer enemy with deeper logistics. That is the kind of reversal states hate, because it turns their old advantage into someone else's production line. The same logic runs through the naval layer. USS Spruance fired a Tomahawk land attack missile during operations in theater, which means Iran was not facing one dramatic burst from one direction. It was under pressure from air, sea, expendable drone mass, and a hidden destruction layer all at once. That is how you make a defending state waste precious time deciding which threat deserves priority when all of them do. By this point, the pattern is not mysterious anymore. The classified element was real, but it was not a lone silver bullet. It was a partly hidden strike architecture designed to hit muscle, eyesight, timing, and confidence together. Then came the victory language. The claim was that the goals had been accomplished. Governments say that for a reason. If the enemy believes the job is finished, deterrence gets stronger. If allies believe it, cohesion holds. If markets believe it, panic stays lower. But the bolder the claim, the more dangerous the gap becomes if the facts underneath it are still moving. And the facts did keep moving. The United States could determine with certainty that about 1/3 of Iran's missile arsenal had been destroyed. Another part was uncertain. Another part was buried. So this was never a clean story of total erasure. It was a story of heavy degradation, damaged access, and a race to decide whether surviving uncertainty still had strategic value. Picture the command problem now. One officer wants certainty, another wants speed. Someone else wants a confident statement for the cameras. Meanwhile, crews are still trying to work out what can be reached, what can be moved, what can be repaired, and what only exists now as a claim on a briefing slide. That is how wars get misread while they're still hot. That gap is where the information war lives. Washington needs Tehran to feel that resistance is draining into futility. Tehran needs its own system, its proxies, and the market to feel that pain can still be imposed. The same buried launcher can be read as ruined, delayed, recoverable, or politically useful, depending on who needs the story. Now the map widens, and this is where a lot of people still miss the real punch. An oil tanker does not have to sink for a weakened Iran to gain leverage. It only has to turn around. That is the entire logic of residual power in the Gulf. If Tehran can make crews hesitate and routes wobble, then battlefield damage inland does not automatically cancel strategic pressure at sea. That is why talking about Iran as harmless after the strikes is fantasy. Even a badly weakened Iran can still escalate with asymmetric weapons, especially in ways that hit global markets and shipping. When clean retaliation becomes harder, messy retaliation becomes more attractive. That puts tanker captains, insurers, and port planners right in the middle of the war, whether they like it or not. And this is where the second human anchor comes in. Somewhere in the Gulf, a shipping manager is not counting ideology or battlefield prestige. He is counting risk, delay, insurance, exposure, rerouting costs, and whether one more turn in Hormuz wipes out the week's plan. That is how a surviving threat becomes a living weapon even before the next shot is fired. A lot of wars are misunderstood because people stare at the explosion and ignore the spreadsheet. But this fight moves through both. A buried launcher hits fear one way. A delayed tanker hits it another. Washington is trying to make both pressures arrive together. Washington understood that, which is why it widened the fight. The blockade was announced to involve all Iranian ports. That move says the campaign was no longer satisfied with pounding buried missile infrastructure and declaring momentum. It was shifting into strangulation, trying to turn military shock into commercial suffocation before Tehran could stabilize the board. Iran answered in the place where it still knows. Fear multiplies fastest. It reversed course on reopening the Strait of Hormuz and reimposed restrictions on the critical waterway. That is not the move of a state that thinks it has no tools left. It is the move of a state trying to remind everyone that damage is one thing, control is another. And the sea can still carry panic farther than a crater can. If you are sitting in Tehran when that happens, the problem changes shape again. First, the strike comes for what you can launch. Then the blockade comes for how you breathe. Then Hormuz turns unstable and reminds you the war can still spread costs outward, even while your own room to move keeps shrinking. That is what real pressure feels like. It keeps changing the axis. And that is a shock in plain terms. The hit did not stop at the target. It kept moving from the mountain entrance to the launch timetable, from the launch timetable to the tanker route, from the tanker route to the negotiating table. Then the nuclear layer sharpened the stakes again. Fordo, Natanz, and Esfahan were confirmed to have been hit. Once those names are in the damage picture together, the pressure stops looking like a simple exchange over missiles and shipping lanes. It starts looking like a contest over how far coercion can go around strategic infrastructure before miscalculation gets a much darker opening. The earlier record matters too. At one stage, there was no indication that installations like the Bushehr nuclear power plant, the Tehran research reactor, or other nuclear fuel cycle facilities had been damaged or hit. The earlier uncertainty is not a footnote. It shows how fast the battlefield outran the public picture, and how much of this war has been lived in the gap between real damage, delayed confirmation, and deliberate ambiguity. And ambiguity was not just background noise here. It was part of the pressure. If Tehran cannot fully show what survived, Washington can magnify the sense of loss. If Washington does not fully explain what it used, Tehran has to assume the next strike may carry layers it still has not solved. That is how a classified effect keeps working after the initial blast. That is also why the early public confusion mattered. Confusion was not just a reporting problem, it was part of the effect. When the target is still counting damage, the market is still guessing intent, and the region is still trying to decide whether this was a strike or the opening shape of something larger. Pressure keeps multiplying on its own. So here is the hard answer in plain language. The blow was not just a hidden object flying into a target. It was a method that hid depth, access, reaction time, trade, and confidence in one rolling sequence. That is why this matters. A secret device can be studied. A method like this is worse. It keeps pressing after the explosion, and it keeps forcing choices before the other side has recovered its footing. If Tehran understood that in the first hours after the strike, then the real shock was recognition. The pressure was not over. It was only changing shape. The next sign you should watch will not be the loudest one.